Okay, good evening, welcome, and apologies, though it's not my fault at all for this delay. This should be an interesting session because I don't think this is a panel where everyone has ever met anyone. Well, some of us have met some of us sometimes, but all of us have never met each other before. So that gives you lots of disparity, which is necessary if you're going to discuss something as non-linear as when WTO met Westphalia, preserving the liberal economic order. I know very little about this matter, so what I shall do is ask the panelists who have all read the brief to commence discussion, 3 to 4 minutes each, and then depending on interest and hands, I shall either throw it open to the audience for the participants for a few comebacks, or I shall ask them a counter question. That entirely depends on whether you feel ready and able to abandon your dinners and ask questions. Remember, we have not eaten, so this will end on time. All right. So can I then please start by, I've been told not to introduce the panelists, it's all in your bios. So I'm going to start with you, Carol, if you would care to give us your thoughts and sort of open up the discussion, WTO, Westphalia, etc. 3 minutes, thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and I found it splendid what Raisina manages, or whatever manages to do here, and to get a bit, at least for me, coming from Europe, a bit detached from the debates which we have in Europe, and to try to connect with debates which we have here or which we have around the globe. But let me begin this debate by saying, look, that we have to watch out if we follow debates about our system becoming more protectionist, more state-led, like also at the moment the Prime Minister from Norway was referring to the bias in our information flow, which we have at the moment. I mean, we are very much influenced by social media, by information which is focused on certain issues, but other issues of which we don't know a lot. Or so the media themselves explodes certain issues, and other issues we don't know a lot. Looking at this from Europe, for example, or from the Western media which we have in Europe, we read a lot about what is happening on the transatlantic dialogue, on what we have with Trump. Like today, just as news which broke out that Trump apparently has degraded the EU mission in US and has taken away the diplomatic status of it, all over the media right away, just today. Trump has taken away, or say the White House has taken away, the diplomatic status of the EU mission to the United States. So the EU mission is in charge of negotiating trade deals, or say preparing the ground for trade deals, let's say, with the United States. He has degraded the mission, and that is all over. But if you look at it again in Brussels on other places, like on India, what do we know on India? Very little. We read very little about India. On China, we may know a bit more, but we know that the information flow in China is extremely controlled. So again, what do we know about other places in the world? I don't know. Second point I wanted to make is that, to probably say, are we going towards more away from the multilateral system? And of course, the focus is certainly also in the beginning, in the introductory talk, let's say it was on everybody's minds, is the United States. But we know that the United States for the last 20 or 30 years has already been an outlier and has not respected certain international norms. We know very well the United States is not a member of or has not signed up to the International Criminal Court, has not signed up to some international weapons treaties. We have not been ratified in the United States. And at the moment, for example, they are nominating judges in the appellate court of the WTO, by which it cannot function. But again, let's say this WTO issue is a lot in the news, but it is, on the other hand, somewhere a constant element in US history that the US is always a bit refraining from signing up to international agreements, and certainly there are some of these things which I just mentioned. On the other hand, let's say there is, I think, too much focus on saying that the multilateral order is in trouble. We have seen in Europe, for example, recently a lot of debate about the UN Migration Pact. The United Nations Migration Pact was signed in the end by 166 countries. We also had, let's say, Katowice only 2 or 3 weeks ago. All member states of the United Nations signed up, let's say, to the new COP24 climate change agreement, which was agreed in Poland. So again, there to say, look, we don't have to look at it only in saying which things are not working. There are certainly things in the international multilateral order which are working. But looking at it from an EU perspective, since I'm coming from the European Union, EU is also a multilateral order. And even if we have at European Union level also many problems, the EU's multilateral order is also working. And there are many things here which I've catched up in the last 2 days that I'm here in India. India is looking at the way in which the EU is trying to organize its own multilateral order between 27 or 28 member states, is trying to see whether they can, for example, a very well-known example, the data protection rules, the GDPR, as we call it in Europe, whether some elements of it can be used or could be useful for India. We know that GDPR, on the other hand, is not respected at all in China, but the US at the moment, on the other hand, is also trying to see, Zuckerberg said it himself literally in a Senate hearing, we could probably take over the GDPR rules in the United States. So there are other elements I could mention. Let's say that you say that in the EU, its multilateral order is working. And it's, for me, another example to say, look, I mean, we shouldn't overdo, let's say, that the multilateral order is under threat. There are many elements of it which are working and which are well established and which continue to function, certainly the way I look at it from a European perspective. Thank you.
That was a great introduction, and to keep the momentum going, may I invite you, Sharon, to come in with your perspective? Thank you.
It's an honor to be here today with my distinguished panelists. I think from the private and the finance sector perspective, the question here to us is really about the role of disruptive innovation. And I know today we're talking about economics and governments playing a big role, but I honestly believe that the very idea in which we review our interactions in society through economics and trade relations is increasingly being disrupted by other non-state actors. So I think today it would be a really good discussion if we could talk a little bit about, not so much about the polarization per se, but more of other actors and other sort of trends that we see here today. For example, I would also like to share a little bit about China, Japan, and Singapore, and how us in Asia look at the EU and the liberal economic order from our perspective. Thank you.
That was short. I'm going to have to ask you a question. Can you specify what you mean by non-state actors and the importance?
Well, non-state actors, I would suppose, your usual like multilaterals and things like that, but I'm really focusing here on startups, technology innovators, corporates that are increasingly opening up and things like that, because I honestly believe that the policy reform is always slow and always plays catch up to technology. And if the 20th century is characterized by the physical flow of goods, then the 21st century is really about data flow. And you can't talk about data without talking about innovation. So I guess what I'm trying to drive at here is that when we look at the polarized, well, I should stop using that word, but when we look at the liberal economic order and all the transformations that has been happening over the past few years, we need to look at other roles on the periphery.
That's absolutely brilliant. And Deepak, I hope you were listening very carefully, because you're up next, and essentially what she was saying is that you epitomize the non-state actor. So over to you.
So I think I'd like to start by clarifying that I'm going to address this more from a legal, regulatory, and policy perspective, and how these problem statements, and the problem statements talk about non-market economies becoming models of success, the rise of nationalist and nativist politics, and the questions that arise from there was, can the economic order that served as the basis for decades of growth and prosperity survive? And the second point that was been put up for debate really is, must we adapt to meet these challenges, and if so, should we fight them or accommodate them? I think the answer to question one really is that the liberal international economic order that has pervaded our lives for the last 6 to 7 decades has been based on the Western philosophy of capitalist economics, but with an underlying social welfare component, very, very strong social welfare component based on a set of shared ideals between US, UK, and a couple of and the European countries or the developed economies. And I think between globalization, between the emerging market economies such as the BRICS nations and other developing economies, and technology, of course, has played a big role in disrupting the entire basis for which the capitalist and social welfare economics has been founded in these developed countries. I think there's been a conflict, and I think what needs to be done is somehow that liberal international economic order can't sustain, in my view, the way it was. I think it has to be reshaped. I think it has to be realigned. I think it has to take into account all the other developing economies and their constraints. Whether the China model will work or whether the Russian model or the Indian model will work, we don't know. However, I do believe that India has a big role. India being the largest democracy, we have traditionally adopted a social welfare economic policy. Post-1991 liberalization, we've moved towards a mix of social welfare plus capitalism. It's been neither here nor there, but we've stumbled our way to a fairly decent growth rate, etc. However, I think we have a big role to play in helping the US and other developing economies to reshape that liberal international economic order and make a popular or public interest argument in favor of that. Thank you.
Okay, that's interesting. And just for the sort of our international guests, there is a debate in India which sort of very much follows China on whether the moment has come for India to actually sort of act more actively multilaterally and try and shape things, or is it that we need to make sure that we have a much stronger base at home first before we do this? China took its time, and that does not mean that we take our time for the reasons that I think you mentioned. But it's an interesting debate, and I think you will find resonances of this throughout Raisina. So then I'm very tempted to change the order, but I won't. Since Sanjeev did insist he'll be last, and he's in the Ministry of Finance and they pay my bills, so I shall defer to him. Andreas, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ratin. Thanks to Raisina and the colleagues. You're doing a terrific job in bringing the people here together. I need to reveal a secret to the audience. When we met before, nobody thought how difficult it will be to make sense out of the title. So I will try, being the only German on the panel, I will try to focus on what Westphalia means, what multilateralism means, and in a third element, how we at the OECD believe it should be further developed. So for those of you who are not aware what Westphalia means, there are 2 cities in Germany who hosted the conference for the Westphalian peace. After, it's 400 years ago, in 1648, after 30 years when Europe was in a terrible civil war. And this was seen as the birth of the national state in Europe. So we have a concept in our panel today, which is the concept of the national state. And many people see in today's world a reinvention of the national state as the key actor versus the multilateral system. So I'm not taking you back to the Vikings, but only 400 years to German history. And then we moved to 70 years ago, in 1948. 44, the World Bank was founded. 45, the United Nations. 48, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs came into force. So 300 years after the Westphalian peace, it took us 300 years to develop a multilateral order, which we describe today as the liberal multilateral orders, which means that states realized that there is value in cooperate internationally in giving some sovereignty, not all the sovereignty, but some sovereignty to multilateral bodies like the WTO, like some development tasks to the World Bank. The OECD was founded in '61 as a follow-up to the Marshall Plan organization with the aim of develop policy advice, better policies for better lives, do peer reviews and stuff like that. So this is the historical background we are discussing, or under which background we are discussing today's world. So my first thesis is, let's not get too worried. We are speaking against a 400-year tradition. We are speaking about a 70, 80 years multilateral tradition, which served us very well, which served also many of our national interests very well. Now, we would not, it's not the time to be complacent. We need to think about how can we preserve this multilateral order and how can we develop it further. Because we have in France, we have people in the street, we have unhappy steelworkers in the US, we have Brexit, we have many populist moments in the world which underpins that there is something, maybe something not really right in our systems, mainly in Western democracies. So the question is, how can we develop further the multilateral order as we know it going forward? First of all, there is a need for reform, and I think many of the countries in the G20 agreed that there is a case for reforming the WTO, making it more efficient. There is a case, and here I'm completely with our colleague Deepak, saying we need to make this more adaptable, more inclusive, especially with countries and with interest from the emerging economies, from the emerging and the developing world. The IMF quota reform is one example. There is also the question of moving, which has happened, moving the G8 to the G20, bringing in more the interest. So we need to develop, and that's my plea, we need to develop this new order together. Advanced economies, emerging economies, developing economies. So this is a case. The third thing, which I think we need to look at forms where multilateralism works. For example, on the taxation agenda, we at the OECD, we have only 38 OECD members, but in our forum for automatic exchange for tax information, we now have 152 countries. And in the base erosion and profit shifting, which makes sure that companies like Facebook and others, I know I'm too long, but I'm smart, okay? No, I'll stop in a second. So we have 128 countries. So we need to find the topics which are appealing. And third one, we need to make sure that, and this is my really last point, we need to make sure that we take the people on board. And this brings me to the question about, we have not been smart enough to explain why free trade is conducive, is good for all the people. And we have not taken all the people on board. We observe in OECD economies that the share of the richest 10% in their disposable income is 9.6% higher than those of the lowest 10%. And this has moved up from 7 to 1. So there is a question about to address inequality. We have not paid too much attention on flanking policies for trade policies. We've always had just liberalize, open up the market, and not invest too much in education and skills policies. And so we need to work and bringing the people with us in support of the international system. And with that, I stop, Mr. Moderator, and apologize for being too long.
Not at all, because you are provocative. I have a question for you, but I shall defer. Now, I want to quickly see whether there's anyone in the audience, and I shall decide. Now, anyone in the audience who speaks, at the risk of my cutting it short, will have to be very brief, because we want to keep this interactive. I see one hand. Do I see another? I see one hand. That is perfect. Do I see another? Otherwise, stand up and show me. I see two hands, okay? So brief. And I see three, Andre, I of course. So 1, 2, and 3. Please go ahead. Keep it short, less than 1 minute. Thank you. I can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Panel, how do you combat the rise of anti-globalization forces across nations across countries across the world right now, where people are demanding, like the Yellow Vest in France, like many of Trump's supporters, who do not like the new global system. And I want to know the panel's thoughts on this. How do you combat them? How do you comfort them in a democratic society?
All right. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know what the last speaker and I think some of the other speakers before that have said, that we need to change the existing system. And if you look around, you have given some examples, whether it is the IMF or some of the other institutions. But if you look at the WTO, that is the subject that we are discussing today, there are attempts that are being made to change the system. All these so-called rounds, or what we have now, the Doha Development Agenda, it is an attempt to change the system. You get more on agriculture, more on IPRs, more in terms of market access. So what it appears is that the world is not ready for it, meaning, and I would like to get your responses, is the change not deep enough, not rapid enough, or is it too rapid and too deep? That is why there is resistance to it, because from 2001 to 2019, today, 18 years, we've hardly seen any outcome, any results, except maybe, the trade facilitation agreement that came out in 2014. There's been no change. So it is an attempt to make a change, but of course, it appears that the consensus is not working. It's not happening.
Thank you. Andre?
Thank you, Rathan.
He's from Brazil, so be kind.
I'd just like to raise the issue of the proposals for reforming the WTO, which aim to maintain the relevance of this multilateral regime. But as you know, they focus on the dispute settlement mechanism, which in my view is the portion of the WTO that's still relevant and that's working the best. So I'd just like to hear the panelists on these reform proposals.
That's brilliant. I actually omitted to bring Sanjeev in, but all the sort of nerdy WTO economics questions came at the very end. So Sanjeev, you say what you want to say, you get 2 extra minutes to talk about this, and I would like to then go to the other panelists.
Okay, I mean, basically, I think the issue here is that we have clearly a breakdown of a certain liberal order. And the question is, what replaces it? And 1, do we want to reform this? And 2, is this breakdown to a nation-state-based system better, worse, or what does it mean? And hence the Westphalia issue. I think I'll deal with the first, and I think the first thing one needs to be very clear about is that a liberal global order is not an order that is for the personal benefit of people who self-identify as liberals. I want to make this point because we have an environment where we have a lot of debate about, let's say, on one side you have the China, which has obviously kept its markets very closed, but has been able to generate companies like Baidu and Alibaba and so on. But the rest of the world has consequently allowed itself, in some ways one could argue, to be digitally colonized by Silicon Valley, whether it's Google or Amazon or name it. And it is not entirely obvious to me that what the Chinese did was an obviously foolish thing in retrospect, especially given the fact that we now find that many of these entities have sort of outgrown themselves and are a law unto themselves. I mean, the Cambridge Analytica episode clearly shows. Recently, the CEO of Twitter came to India and was happily interfering with our political views. Why should these platforms be allowed to dictate terms? And Europe too has been dealing with this issue. So I think, first of all, let's be very clear. The business of keeping a liberal world order is about keeping things open for trade. And there has to be some systems to ensure that those who are not part of that sort of liberal set who now control many of these institutions their views, their welfare, etc., needs to be taken into account. I think this is a very important part. In fact, it shows through in multiple ways. I mean, one obvious way was when the Brexit vote was being done, one of the strange things that the anti-Brexit, i.e. Remain camp did, was to bring in large numbers of these same people to campaign for the Remain campaign, which was Obama, various movie stars, and various CEOs of companies. And I can bet my bottom dollar that was one of the key reasons that the Brexit thing happened, because people were clearly voting against this. So I think this is a very important thing we need to take into account. It's not obvious to me that the old order was delivering the goods at the bottom, and it is not obvious to me that it is actually repairable. We probably really need to think seriously about what we go with. The second part is that what then are we ending up with? And this is coming about to the issue of nation states. Now, interestingly, much of this is basically about state-led capitalism. I would like to clarify that it's state-led capitalism, not state-led. I mean, state-led bits like North Korea, etc., and Venezuela.
Capitalism, state-led capitalism.
Yeah. So, and it seems to succeed in many, many parts of the world, in East Asia in particular, and consequently, leading to many people thinking that they can adopt such strategies. By the way, there is a long history of doing this. The West, when it was rapidly industrializing, used exactly this strategy. I mean, what was the East India Company? It was a multinational company, but it was very much a mercantilist enterprise, which is basically what state-led capitalism is. What was Commodore Perry doing in Yokohama Harbor? So the point is, let us be very, very clear that when the West was expanding, it actually also had a state-led capitalist model. It was certainly wasn't going for the rule-based liberal order. So it was a certain order that came about for the convenience of a certain group of countries, which were the dominant countries of the late 20th century in the West. And with the collapse of the alternative, which was the Soviet alternative, it became basically the global order. It hasn't lasted for anything more than 25 years in the way and form that we are trying to preserve it. There's nothing sacrosanct about it, and it clearly is failing many of the people who are supposed to have signed up to this. So my own sense is, rather than bemoan the decline of the old order, we need to go back to the drawing board and seriously think about an order that everybody wants to sign up to. So with that, let me hand it back.
Wonderful. Sanjeev, thank you for being controversial. I can see many furrowed brows, and I intend calling on you. But I think I'll put in my 2 bits here, summarizing Sanjeev, because I come from a different place than he does, but I actually agree with him, which is quite interesting. I actually agree that we have to think very hard about those who propagate what existed for the reasons he mentioned. My lifetime has not been a fair world, either in terms of the European Union's actions with respect to us, or with respect to what I would call special and differentiated treatment to China, or what I would call a certain avoidance of accepted reality in form of India's place in the world when it came to sort of UN affairs. I don't think, where I disagree with Sanjeev, is that this happened because of any sort of liberal oligarchy that was inhibiting affairs. I do think that there was, in the essence of the liberal order, an understanding that some nation states or groupings such as the European Union would be ceded the right to have a disproportionate say in affairs, and we would have to go along with those rules and quibble at the margin, which is what we have resisted as India, and we have been very unpopular. I mean, the traditional argument in WTO, you will remember about India, is that you guys are a waste of time, you go on holding up things, you talk about agriculture. Well, look where you are now with respect to all these issues. I mean, the second point I think is even more important, that any reimagining of the world order would need to be very clear about the parameters on which it is reimagined. And in the case of the WTO, therefore, we have to ask a fundamental question, which Sanjeev, I think, as a historian, among many other accomplishments, brought out very clearly, when was free trade in the history of the world not enforced through military fiat? The answer is, to me, and I agree with you, not until very recently. It was only with the institution of GATT and the WTO, a painful 55, 60-year-old process, that we began to talk about free trade without battleships. You mentioned Commodore Perry. So I think going forward, we will have to answer these questions, because the moment you use military fiat or coercive power, Westphalia necessarily enters the picture, because that is how power is exercised. That has not changed. You may not have just one superpower. You may have two, and you may have a demographic problem in Europe, but power is exercised not through multilaterals, but through Westphalia. And the second is the need to understand that the very concept of whose free trade, something that my friend economist Hajun Chang, exactly opposed to Sanjeev ideologically on the spectrum, from very much from the left to center, way left of me, posed earlier, free trade for whom and for what. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask any of the panelists if they have a quick comeback on these questions, starting with you.
Can I, Ratan? So, I mean, there are two questions that I got, basically two questions. One was, I think from Kushan, who asked as to why are people so unhappy with their local economies, whether it's in France or whether it's in EU, whether it's in India. That was one question. I think the second question was, WTO is meeting time and again on various rounds. Apparently, they are trying to change, so what's wrong? Why haven't they been able to kind of succeed? So I'll just deal with the first question. I think fundamentally what has happened with globalization, technological disruption, productivity, labor, capital, all that is, and as a flow out of that, government policy, government regulation and laws has been fundamentally, the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer, and income and disparities have just increased manifold. Whether it's not just income disparities, I think discrimination in different forms due to localization of economics and politics, all that has created unhappiness. Now, whether you talk about unhappiness because of job creation or lack of jobs or lack of GDP growth or whatever aspect you attribute to it, fundamentally, it is the haves and the have-nots everywhere across the world that has caused the problem, and therefore every country is now looking inwards to see, let me first try and assuage the poverty problem, the job problem, the inflation problem, or the GDP problem. So I think it's more a knee-jerk reaction to everyone's been caught off guard. And it's happening in this country also. So look at our, if you look at any policy and regulation over the last 10 years, let's not take the short frame, take a 10-year frame. At the end of the day, we come out with great policies, with the right vision, with the right intent. However, it gets hijacked on the way because of the politics of economics that come in. And the politics of economics basically goes to, I will regulate one group over the other. I will either regulate upwards or I will regulate downwards. And I will either regulate in a prescriptive versus a principled. So principle-based regulation can serve agnostic of caste, creed, sex, religion, whatever. Prescriptive will always get into the detailing, and somebody or the other will become unhappy. So I think it's very important to tie in a lot of the debate to how government fundamentally looks at policy, implements it, and executes it, because that is, every citizen lives with law and regulation in every aspect of his life, from jumping a red light to smoking a cigarette to advertising to you name it. Law, regulation, and policy pervades all aspects of our lives. And a population becomes happy or unhappy depending on how that is basically implemented, right? So I think that's my second answer to the person to Kushan, who raised the unhappiness factor. On the WTO aspect, I think what I would like to put across is that I think WTO is trying to make an effort of you know, all the G8 and all these rounds. I think the only level at which they can reach is they need to find common ground. So climate change is one common ground where I think generally they've got most nations on board. Food security is another issue which I think most nations have come on board. However, I think if you take topics like intellectual property, I think our notion of intellectual property, where we believe that IP has to be a balance between accessibility for the public at large, at affordable pricing, versus the Western capitalist view of, you know, I will price to the maximum and exploit my exclusivity. So I'm saying on many aspects we differ, but I think you have to figure out in WTO where is common ground.
Thank you, that's brilliant. Carol?
If I can react on another question, let's say on this unhappiness, but I think the unhappiness is above all, let's say, with the issue which we see in Europe as well as at an international level, is that these international institutions seem to be very far away from people, and people cannot control what is going on. So there is a big problem, I think, about accountability, about what is being discussed in these international fora, and how do I, as a citizen, have a view on that. We had, for example, in Europe, about 1.5 years ago, let's say there's a big debate about CETA, I mean the Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement, which was attacked by certain groups, certainly leftist groups in society, saying, look, I mean, this agreement will give much powers, a lot of powers to private corporations to challenge states, and we won't be able to do anything against that. I think we have a bit the same feeling probably with, I mean, what the population thinks about WTO or about other international institutions. We have no view about what is being discussed. I referred a moment ago to this UN Migration Pact. Another part of the multilateral order was still signed by 166 countries, but it was a lot of, has raised to a lot of debate in Europe. People were saying, like in my own country in Belgium, who has dictated the rules of the UN Migration Pact? We haven't got any say. Of course, they had got some say, but the feeling was again, let's say, these institutions are living above our head and there is no accountability about what they're doing. However, again, I would say this is an issue which has been around since a long time. Some of you may remember Seattle. Seattle, when was it? 1992 or 1993, when it was a huge, one of the first big movements against these big international organizations and the power they have. So again, it's something which is 25 years or more years old. I mean, the problem which I think, which we have, let's say, is that we have these multilateral organizations which, as you were saying, originated 70, 75 years ago, or Andreas was saying this. And of course, our world has changed enormously in the meantime. And there is a lot of resistance with states. Think about, for example, there was a reference made to the IMF in Europe to changing the role of the European states and the IMF. Europe has and will continue to decline in economic importance in the coming years, but the European states attach a lot of importance to their role in the IMF. But let's say the shares which they have, for example, in the capital of the IMF, are no longer representative, let's say, with their economic might. But can we reform this? This is only one element. Extremely difficult to reform. It is a form of inertia. And probably it's only a big crisis which can reform these institutions.
Thank you. I can't resist coming in on that. So I need to tell you something that happened with the IMF. The IMF only survives today because Europe had a crisis. We used to call it the IMF of Turkey. That was more or less the only large country that had a program with the IMF. So what did the IMF do? I'm abusing my position as chair, but I think you'll find this interesting. They imposed something called a systemic exemption. Every country that went into the IMF program before Portugal, Greece, and Ireland, European countries, had to do a debt sustainability analysis on the basis of which conditionalities were set. It was very clear that these three basket cases in Europe would fail that condition. So the IMF just changed the rules. I know this because in 2014, when they were better off, they came back saying, we want to come back to the old rules because now we've dealt with Europe. So when you were saying that it is entropy, it's not entropy. I think it's far more deliberate. It's my controversial opinion. I think it's an attempt to hang on. Britain did it very well, to power well beyond the best by date. And the IMF and many other multilateral organizations, I'm not talking the WTO, represent that. And before I go to you, I must say the OECD has done a tremendous job of not becoming like that, of becoming more adaptive and trying to almost seduce countries that were not part of the OECD to join them. So what do you think?
This was a nice ball. Thank you very much for putting the ball on the penalty. But my friend Sanchez has put another ball on the penalty, which I need to kick in the other goal, not in the, because I want to defend what you call the Western liberal order, because it's really an order which is rules-based, which is transparent, and where everybody has its fair saying. If you look at the WTO, you may like it or not, but the WTO has not been designed to exploit India or China or countries in Africa. The WTO has been decided, and has been brought to the table, or has opened up the table for all the countries on equal footing, and it's a rules-based order. The question is now, do we need, I mean, I don't think, like some of you said, that we need to go back to the drawing board, but we certainly need to reform. And I'll give you an example. I think we're still doing trade policies for the industrial age. And this little device here, this little machine, we all using, we're spending more time with it than with our children, with our wives. And we are even more careful sometimes than with our personal relationship if you look at many people. But is this a product or a service? This has been produced by 694 companies in 43 countries. And in our trade statistics, it's a product which has been exported from the US to Europe, where my company or where my organization has bought it. So we need to adapt the trade policies also to the digital age. And this brings me to the second point, which is, I think we have not prepared, and here I'm with Carol, we have not prepared our people enough in the Western world, but also probably also in emerging economies, what this digital change, what globalization means to them. And there is the question about the winners and the losers, and that's the question, what can we do more than trade policies, in education policies and skills policies, to bring these people up to the speed of the technological development and to make them clear that open trade and free trade is something which is in the benefit of them. Because make no mistake, all the 7% growth rate in India is largely because you're confronted with open trade and investment market elsewhere. It's not only because it's such a of course, India is a vibrant market, but it's also because you have open trade and investment market elsewhere. And that brings me to the third and last point, and to the question you raised, Mr. Moderator. I deeply believe that all international organizations need to, be up to speed with the technological development, and also be up to speed with the changes in the global economy. And that's why we have been opening up the OECD to countries like Brazil, to India, to China, to embark on partnerships, because we really believe it's key to have everybody on board in the structure, and to see how can we solve the problems we have in the world together. Stop here.
Thank you. Hello. So just to play a bit of a devil's advocate, so from the other end of the spectrum, because you're from Europe, Andreas, there are 2 points I want to make here. The first is that we talk a lot about reform of organizations like the WTO and the IMF. At the same time, though, I do believe that how can the same system which created a problem, which is all the disparity, the unhappiness, the inequalities, actually how can that system be reformed from within? I believe we need to look outside the system. Otherwise, you're merely perpetuating the very same power relations and the same disparities that characterize our problem today. So that's the first thing on reform. The second thing is that I would like to push back a bit on Andres, and I actually agree very much with Sanjeev on how essentially the liberal economic order is a club of the West, and I think that the WTO is essentially a function of that as well. What I mean by the club of the West is that you're saying an increasingly different world order today, where countries like China embody a completely different perspective to the liberal economic order of the past few decades. So I used to work with the Chinese government actually in the NDRC in Beijing. I worked on the green finance ecosystem at that time in 2014. And during that time, I was privy to a lot of interesting discussions and insights into how China goes into Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, how it brokers relationships, how it transforms their economies, and essentially how these state-owned enterprises become the giants that they are in the global marketplace today. So I believe when we look at these different players beyond what is the Club of the West, the question here is not really about reform, is it? It's really about how do we reimagine a new future where the sort of inclusivity you talk about can actually be, concretized. And I really believe technology disruption, as I mentioned before, even bilateral relationships like Japan and Singapore, for example, are trying to plug in a hole in which all this unhappiness that everyone has mentioned today actually stems from. So that's just my opinion. I actually don't know much about the WTO, so I'm the first to admit that. I'm just, coming in as a layperson and commenting on these issues. I'm sure my colleagues here have a lot of rebuttals.
No, I don't think not rebuttals, but certainly possibly reactions. No, I want to just say one thing to what you said, which resonated. I was talking to our Minister of State for Civil Aviation day before yesterday. And India is going to be buying 1,100 aircraft from somewhere. I hope Brazil, Andre. I made a pitch for Embraer. But as of now, not one of them is going to be made in India. Now, in India, what we normally do is we blame us, saying we didn't get them to make them. But how come it doesn't make sense for them? If you're talking about multilateralism, polarity, etc., to make the business case that if you're going to build 1,100 aircraft, at least 200 should be made in India. The onus is entirely upon the nation state to make the case for such trade to happen. And that loses me political constituents when I talk about free trade. So in a sense, I think all three of us from coming to very different angles are saying the same thing, that there are distinct perceived advantages in the abstract of free trade, for which reason we have been good soldiers of the WTO, unlike China, may I remind you, for a long time. But those are not going to be enough politically, and what we are seeing now is that question being asked for the first time in the developed world as well. So I do agree with both of you. I think we will have to reimagine in a far more fundamental way than we have in the past. But let me get back to you. I see Vivan, you go number one. Any table here that has not? Yes. I don't know your name. Your table's taken. I'll come back to you if there's space. Yes, and we stop there. I'm sorry, we'll take you in the third round. Vivan, please start, and then we'll go to Prashant there. And then you, sir, and then Mukulika, you last.
My question is to everyone, but particularly Mr. Sanyal, because he's arguably been the most controversial so far. Sir, do you think the...
You're living up to reputation.
If we characterize the multilateral system as one which represents a certain set of principles, are you not in favor of the consensus principle? And if not, what does that mean for your vision of India and the world?
All right, wait. Sanjeev, answer this. Okay. This is too juicy for you.
I know, I like this. See, ultimately, it has to be about accountability to the citizens of the world to sign up to this. As it happens to be, the way the political institutions around the world have been set up as they stand today are Westphalian. So the nation state is the route through which the citizens of the country exercise and hold accountable those who run the world. As these institutions, however, have become flourished and become more powerful, several things have happened. One is that these institutions have become powerful in their own right. This is one of the claims made, for example, about the European Union. And therefore, for example, Britain decided, at least a majority of the British population decided that they wanted to opt out. But even where people are not walking out in that sense, I do think that there is a case for making a much more fair distribution of this. Because at the end of it, for example, a case was made just now that take the IMF, for example. For historical reasons, is dominated by the Europeans. Why should it continue into the future to be the case? And this shift in economic power has now happened quite some time back. It's not something that's just recent. It's now, we are well into it for quite some time. And we need to begin to, quite apart from moral reasons, purely math reasons, we need to begin to change that. So I think the issue of accountability of the system is it. And when this system begins to feel that it is somehow not accountable, then obviously this begins to break down. I mean, one is just the what should I say, the PR part of it, but there is actually a genuine lack of link, even within America, which at least was the dominant power in the previous, the order that has just broken down. Even within America, there was a revolt towards this liberal order, suggesting to me that there is a genuine breakdown of the old system. It's not merely about, convincing people or populist politicians and so on. I would argue that the populist politicians are a reflection of what people were thinking on the ground anyway. It's not like they've been whipped out by evil fascist groups.
No discussion on India allowed. We're discussing WTO and Westphalia. Otherwise, we'll be here all night on this particular point. I would like to add that, remember that, in addition to what Sanjeev was saying, l'exception européenne was implemented by the IMF after the 2008 financial crisis. They suspended the rules for Europe. They would never do that for Nigeria. They would never do that for Ghana. But they suspended the rules for Europe. So there is an active, concrete negative implication to this power hangover happening, which is that when things happen that go badly for Europe, they're able to use multilateral institutions to suspend stuff. There's not much we can do about it, so we watch and keep quiet, some of us. But it is important to understand that we are not unaware that this is happening.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, I mean, it's quite interesting that it is one of the European countries that has first walked out of that advantageous thing. However, the thing that really find curious, that I understand why the British wanted to go out of Europe, but why is Europe unhappy about it? Because, you see, we Indians also experienced Brexit in 1947. We have a holiday named after that. And I, in fact, checked with the Americans. They also experienced in 1776 Brexit, and things worked out quite well. So the real mystery to me is, what is the problem?
Okay, I'm sorry, we are holding you up. You, sir, and then Prashant, and then Mukunika.
Thank you. The problem is that Britain is not the colonial power in Europe, but perceives it the other way around, being colonized by Brussels. I guess that's part of the story. Still, I want to commend you, Sanjeev, for the clarity of your opening statement, in which you said that Westphalia, the return of the nation state, is not actually the problem with WTO. You mentioned state-led capitalism. One could add tech companies which operate beyond the control of nation state. So we actually have a weak nation state hindering a trading system. But after commending you, I would like to not let you off the hook without the then what question, because you ultimately asked for a new system to be designed. You mentioned accountability. You mentioned accountability towards the citizens. So I'd actually be interested in, maybe a couple of sentences of what do you envisage and how would you like to implement it? Because going back to the drawing board means we've had a catastrophe before. There is no going back to the drawing board where the system is still, even if barely, working. So are you presuming a breakdown so that you can then take the plans out of the drawer and present a new WTO? Thank you.
I'd like you both to also respond to that question, but let's take the full round. Prashant?
I find some of the debate is actually sort of tangential to one of the really other big issues at play, which is really the growth of the multinational companies, and not just tech companies, but every type of company. So if you think about a lot of the agenda of the multinational order, is essentially free movements of goods, people, and capital. And what this really benefits is essentially the weakening of the power of the Westphalia states and the strengthening of flows which are really to do with the economic interests of these companies. And what you see with things like Brexit or either the vote of Trump or Sanders or Corbyn, I mean, a lot of these kind of fringe people, is really people in a country getting fed up of not being able to express themselves as anything other than consumers. Life is more than just cheap prices and varied goods. It's also having good quality jobs. It's about having a feel that you're actually part of a society and that you understand the things taking place around you. And I think this kind of conversation we're having about is it the West or is it the East that's in ascendancy is actually missing the other kind of dimension here, which is the lack of importance of countries now and the expansion of importance of companies.
Yeah, thank you. Probably as an Indian living in Britain, having to live with the consequences of Brexit, I think it's quite important to get the details right. In fact, the interference of the sort, Sanjeev, that you're talking about, absolutely rightly, of places like Facebook and Google and big giants like that. In the Brexit referendum case, what has really been revealed is that it is the Leave campaign that has been funded in ways that are unexplained. Aaron Banks' name, everybody knows that story. So while I take your point about Theresa May's point about citizens of nowhere and Obama lining up, supporting the Remain story, the illustration that you use, the point that you were making, it's actually the other side of the referendum. Now, this is to really raise an issue that I think you've all tangentially referred to, but we haven't talked about enough, is that somehow the twin processes of, in fact, a rise of nationalism, a rise of populist nationalism that has been taking place, combined has been really, one reading is that it's a response to the lack of control of an increasingly globalized economy. But that economy is not just about multilateral organizations, it's about financialization. Right? So a lot of these institutions that have been formed at a time when the economy was much more about manufacturing nuts and bolts, whereas now the growth of inequality is as much because of the invisibility of money, because the economy is a much more financialized world. And given we have economists of the panel, I would really appreciate your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, I'm told we have to wrap up this panel. So I'm going to take your question, and I think PSM, you had a comment to make. I can take one more if there's anybody. 3210, nobody. So the two of you, and then we come back for responses.
Well, taking a cue from our keynote speaker, Honorable Prime Minister of Norway today, that we have to move from oratory to delivery and from rhetoric to results. It's all very cliche and fashionable to talk about reimagining and reinventing and re-engineering WTO. But the sad reality is that when President Trump has the trump card and his trade commissioner, Robert Lighthouser, has the lighthouse and has the power of Jesus to take us from darkness to light, how can we guys without Trump and Lighthouser really come to a decision? It's and as economists, Sanjeev Sanyal and Ratin Roy, you all know that ideal solutions only lie in textbook economics.
I don't know that.
In the big, bad, ugly world, it is second best solutions or third best solutions. And as Herbert Simon said, let us not optimize, let us satisfy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We will satisfy and we will respond, right? PSM, you have the last question, and then we have about 2 minutes each. If I have time, I'll say something.
Friends, the WTO itself was multilateralization of sovereignty. And if you look at the 1948 Havana Charter debate, US had a problem even then, a Westphalian mind, that they cannot give up their sovereignty to a foreign body which is going to then decide on disputes which their courts cannot intervene in. And it's the same issue which has come up again. So at the moment, the US is very unhappy with the WTO dispute settlement system. In fact, it has not even implemented many of the decisions which have already been passed, so it's been so recalcitrant about it as such. So if you look at the Westphalian concept in the W, then what you must understand is that the US is a single country, which we've heard before. They are not a good international citizen in many areas. And a proposal has also been made that US today has only about 8% of the world trade. So even if the US is out of the WTO, at least the WTO will continue This has been made by nobody less than Pascal Lamy itself, that plan B or plan B is to move on without the US. So that the fact is that the WTO brought in globalization. It has helped lift a very large number of poor in countries like India and China. So it has had a very beneficial effect by this. And what the panel has discussed is the kind of adverse impact it will have on the liberal order, which has been evolving so far. It can have very bad spillover effects on other issues as well, including lead to military wars. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going back to the panel. Will someone please pick up on the issue of WTO without the US? Would someone please pick up, I'm looking at you, Cheryl, on the entire issue of multinationals and their sort of over cross-border dominance, and then would Sanjeev please pick up on everything people have asked him directly? And for the rest of you, you're free to say what you'd like. So we'll start there, and we'll come here, and we'll finish with Sanjeev.
So can I just want to make a very small point on what the gentleman just raised at the last time around. I mean, it's nice to keep, bashing the US and the nation state for many of the ills that are there present today. But let us just look at fundamentals of economics. And when you look at fundamentals of economics, the US economy is still solid. It's still, the foundations are strong. And I think the one thing that they have succeeded, and the reason they probably succeeded is because at some point in time, they had clarity of thought in what they wanted in terms of affirmative action in economics. We want to be capitalist, and we should have some kind of a social security system, but fundamentally we want free market to play out. Most other economies, whether it's the UK or Europe or China or India, we've always been confused about where we want to go. I mean, we've done half here, half there. It's all been, China is the other extreme. China has gone the complete extreme and said, we will protect our businesses and our economy until they're ready to go global. And we will nurture them from infancy to maturity. So they've taken another extreme. But I think it's about the nation state and countries to be very clear about what their objectives are. So the US, for example, because of the way the US has developed, they may be unhappy today because of globalization, technology, lack of jobs, etc. But you still look at the equitable distribution of wealth and constant creation of value creation, a knowledge-based economy, and constant, ability to, fungibility of jobs, the ability for them to take a product global is still making sure that their fundamentals are good and, people are in general happy there. So I think that's something for us to take away from the good things in the capitalist market.
I can briefly comment probably only on two things. Let's say this issue about multinational corporations and the invisibility of money, since it was raised here. I've worked a lot on, let's say, on issues, what we have done since the financial crisis, certainly in Europe, but also in the United States. And if you see, money has become much more visible and much more traceable than it was in the past. I mean, we have all forms of regulations, not only on banks, but also on all forms of identifiers, who's behind money, and it's much more controlled. I think Andreas can, from the tax perspective, also raise that issue, which he did already a moment ago. I think, let's say, we have much more track on the system, and if you see what the G20 and the G7, above all the G20 are still doing, they're still trying to enforce this further and further. I mean, and there has also been an initiative at European, again, as at international level, I think it was last year, against blackmailing, gray or, offshore financial centers, which are not participating in this reporting system. So a lot has been done. Of course, even if you have this, you cannot do too much about the fact, let's say, that there is this huge divide, which you were mentioning about, let's say, the 1% and so on. But at least money is traceable. I mean, the same applies, let's say, to multinational corporations, and I think multinational corporations, to some degree, lesser than to banks, have to report much more than they had to do in the past. And if you see, for example, one element which is also important to India, sustainability, is another wave of regulation on multinational corporations. Let's say, how sustainable are they? And sustainable not only in environmental firms, also in forms of gender equality, which was, for example, brought up by the Norwegian Prime Minister, or on social terms. So that is coming along. I wouldn't be too concerned, and from that perspective, I think our world order, as compared to 20, 30 years ago, has become already at least much more transparent and certainly a bit better.
Thank you very much. I mean, if it was needed, I mean, this discussion we have today shows me that multilateralism is more important than ever. I don't think that we need to have a fundamental kind of abolishing everything, going back to the drawing board, but we need to reform the system. We need to focus more on this kind of level playing field question, which in many of the interventions were referring to, meaning looking at making sure that multilateral enterprises are paying taxes, making sure that they are relying on responsible business conduct, on corporate social responsibility standards, making sure that we create a level playing field where everybody feels comfortable, and making sure that this level playing field is also clearly communicated to the citizens in a country. Because let's face it, we will not draw globalization back to the drawing board. We will not go back to square one. This is a process which will go on and on. And as I show you with the iPhone, I think this is a process which is going more and more digital. So we need to create this level playing field in a way where we prepare also the people for the technological change we are in. And that's why I was so making such a strong case in all of us, looking into our education and our skill system, making sure that everybody finds a prospect in the society to take part of this fundamental structural change we are currently in. And make no mistake, I mean, if you look at back 100 years ago, I mean, in the UK or Germany, how did, I mean, this was not a smooth transition to the industrial society. And we are in the same complicated transition now to the digital economy. And that's why also we are seeing people in the street. We are seeing people on the street not because of the existence of the WTO. We are seeing people in the street because there is a fundamental change in the society, and that some people have the feeling not to get their fair share. And we need to create a multilateral order which is preparing all the people for that, and which is also giving them the feeling that there is a fair, open and transparent system. And that's why I still believe in a reformed and modified system what we currently have.
Yeah, and if you don't do that, lesson from history is you'll get fascism, right? So we have to be very, very careful we don't have that.
Yeah, sure. So actually, I agree with Andreas. I think when we talk about leveling the playing field, I think we're really talking about leveling the playing field for decision making in a time where we are threatened by climate change and all these global issues. I think I can say that as a representative of my generation, so I'm actually around 30. So I'm actually really young, and as a representative of my generation, I would say that when we talk about all of the issues here today, we're really talking about trust and alienation. That's something that really characterizes our generation and how we perceive and relate to one another, whether through economics, trade, or business, or finance. And when we talk about trust and alienation, we also need to ask ourselves, what are essentially the intermediaries that are the crux of these social interactions? So WTO, for example, is an intermediary for disputes, right, for example. And I would say that to be a bit more future thinking, in the future, obviously, the new trust economy has to be distributed, and it's going to look very much like a peer-to-peer exchange. So obviously when we talk about the phrase, we think about blockchain, but I think beyond that is really about how do we rethink about trust, accountability, and alienation, and at the same time still level the playing field for decision making? Can technology play a role in that? I was also asked to comment very briefly on how non-state actors have emerged in the new world order today. So we talked about your Googles and Facebook and Amazons. I think these non-state actors are increasingly more important, especially for the digital generation like myself. And these non-state actors have to be brought into the conversation, and they cannot have conversations between themselves. And I think this is something that was characterized last year when the EU passed some data privacy laws as well against, I think, if I'm not wrong, was Facebook. So these sort of, it's really characterizing a very complex and changing time, and we need to look beyond what we have, the tools that we have been using so far, and we need to look at technology, innovation, and non-state actors. That is my stance today.
Okay, I've got mine as well. Okay, first of all, let me clarify that it's not that I am making the case that we don't need a global multilateral order. It's just that I am arguing the following things. First of all, we cannot wish away the Westphalian nation state as long as the political structures of accountability to the citizens is structured through these Westphalian nation states. For whatever reason, that's how it is. Well, if you want not to, if you don't want them, then you really have to go back to the drawing board and have to rework that too. So if that is not the one you want to rework and go back to the drawing board for, then you have to make sure that the nation state is a part of the solution and not seen as a part of the problem all the time, which is, I think, one of the problems with the old so-called liberal order. Second, clearly we need some sort of a system, but simply saying that, oh, we need to reform the one, the word reform has to be carefully taken. Is it a mild reform or a very drastic reform? Clearly the system is breaking down, and what we are ending up with is a complicated network of free trade agreements, which frankly is so complicated already that your main driver of competitiveness is the quality of your lawyers. Nobody really knows how it works anymore. So we clearly need to move to something else. And I argue that if you're going to have to do radical reforms, and the radical reforms are going to be in multilateral institutions and not in the institutions of the nation state, then you need to go to some sort of drawing board for the simplest reason. Otherwise, what are we reforming to? So you do need to begin to reimagine the whole thing, and that's the sense in which I'm talking about drawing board. Not in terms of saying we need to wish away what had happened. Of course, we need to learn the lessons of what we there. We need to take along the institutions as they exist, unless we want to rebuild it. But frankly, of many things that we can rebuild, it's even today perhaps easier to reform and rebuild the IMF, the WTO, and all these fellows than to go to every single country in the world and undo their constitution. So, since that is the way we're going to go about it, let's be very clear what we are trying to do. Let's be open-minded about it. And of course, in the end, it has to be a fair system that is transparent and allows everybody to play along. And that is why I am in favor, to some extent, for a willingness for a break from the past, because it comes with too much baggage very often. And so that is why I was talking about going back to the drawing board in that sense. With that, let me hand it back for last comments.
No, John, I look at the time. I have exactly 1 minute. I need to respond to your question, sir, about economics. Yes, absolutely. No, I would disagree with you that we live in a world of the second best. And I'll take my own country's example. We have successfully retained our agricultural policies in the teeth of unreasonable, often hectoring and Jesuitical European opposition. We have retained our policies on coal in the face of heretical and Jesuitical European opposition. The very people who benefited from coal for the last 40 years are now lecturing us on how to reduce it. And we have managed to hold our own. That's a first best for me, in a Westphalian order, so it speaks to what he was saying. In an order where you wish to change the rules and started talking about Norwegian children being mine, I would have a very simple question for Norway, and that is the kind of magnitudinal restructuring he's asking. It's a good economics question. Can you please turn the central heating down, put on some overcoats, and reduce your consumption, and not tell me that you have found more efficient ways to consume as much energy as you always did, except you're going to do it greener, because that is not acceptable to me. If you want to have that kind of conversation, and people are willing, we will possibly have it without Westphalia. If you want to have a conversation about exchange, which is what trade is fundamentally about, then that conversation will be about Westphalia unless there are specific global parametrics which override national concerns in countries which have, in my view, since I'm the moderator, I have the last word, so I'm making a polemical point. Not a polemical point, I can justify it, but polemical to some perhaps, and certainly refutable. In my view, taken advantage of asymmetric power for years, and the least to sort of use that overhang in their own interest. And the example I gave you again, systemic exemption for the IMF. I've always wondered why the Norwegians who made all their money of fossil fuels and are now arguing about carbon budgets and, meet a Scandinavian, they're like Jesuits about the environment, don't just shut off their central heating and sit in overcoats. It's good for the economy as well. I'll make those overcoats for you. We have lots of wool here. But they don't do it. So if you want to ask Sanjeev's point, those difficult questions, we can do it. But we don't do it in polite society, and therefore we fall back into Westphalia. But that does not mean that we are in second best or third best. It does not mean arcane bureaucratic arguing of the G20 sort about things that make no difference to the lives of people. I give you 2 examples. We have maintained agricultural policy, and we have maintained our position on coal in the teeth of intellectual, political, and NGO opposition. So I think I agree with Sanjeev, and I think what I'm getting is the conversation will go along on Westphalian terms, but we have to also recognize that there is thinking in Europe, very deep thinking about alternative possibilities to multilateralism. There is a certain pragmatism that has come with this very disturbing climate change conversation, not so much with the IMF, but more with the climate change conversation, which I think has led our minds to come closer. And as an Indian, I think there is now an increasing recognition that going forward over the next 5 or 10 years, our success or failure in transforming our own economy will determine the future of many global public goods. And therefore, I think the purpose of Raisina, which is to have an engagement which is not India-led, but India-facilitated, with that in mind, is something that we have very successfully as a group achieved today. So all it remains for me to do is to thank my panelists for a lovely conversation, a very interesting one. Thank you for being such a disciplined and obedient audience. Apologize to the very harassed Raisina Dialogue people who are constantly trying to push us out of here so we can get the next some coffee or something event. And I wish you all a peaceful evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratan. A big round of applause for all our panelists.